Hello, it's Alan. It is a Thursday afternoon, a warm Thursday afternoon here in Florida, and I have my cup of coffee as normal outside, enjoying the sun. But today I want to talk about origin stories. Origin stories are all the rage now, as the youngs would say, because I'm not that young. But people want to know if you're talking about the Star Wars universe, if you're talking about superheroes, if you're talking about other characters and shows, people are really into backstories. How did people become who they are? How did superheroes become superheroes? How did people get in the situations that they're in? And, honestly, it's about the same with humanity. There's a real desire for people, I think, to know how we got here. How did humanity get here? So today I want to talk about, is Genesis real? So I don't know where we're going to go down this road and how it's going to turn out, but I really just want to give some things to think about, because humanity is here, people are here, and there's basically two trains of thought, and I'm going to approach this from a Christian perspective. But I think that there's a science perspective that cannot be ignored. Probably one of the most famous quotes or verses in the Bible is, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So, from a Christian perspective, we believe that God created the heavens and the earth. We believe that we are here because God created us. Now, from that point, everything basically can split into two camps. Um, if you're talking about the non-theist, if you're talking from a scientific standpoint, there are people from the scientific standpoint, which rightly so, look at the book of Genesis and they will classify it as a fairy tale. They will classify it as a legend, as a story, something that could not possibly be real. Why? Because the scientific evidence that they have and that science shows us right now shows that the earth is billions of years old. Millions, billions, who knows? It's a very old earth theory. And I think it's rightly deserved to look at science and to look at what we have found in the creation of earth and to take that into consideration when we're looking at how we got here. Science is fascinating. I also believe that science, and the Catholic Church would say this as well, that science can go hand in hand with faith. Science can be used from a faith perspective to really reveal to us how God did the things that He did. Science doesn't negate the work of God. Science sort of goes along and explains how God did what He did. There's nothing wrong with that. So, from a faith perspective, if you're looking at it from a Christian perspective, um, there are a lot of Christians out there, mainly from the evangelical bent, that will say that the earth is probably 6 to 10,000 years old, and that creation took place over 6 days. 6 24-hour days is how creation took place. That was the time that God needed to create the world. And on the seventh 24-hour day, He rested. So, from that perspective, um, Genesis is taken from a very literal standpoint. So, from a Christian perspective, how do we reconcile the two? How do we reconcile it? Now, before I go down any further, I will let you know that I think I've said this to you guys before. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a priest. I'm not an ordained member of the Catholic Church. I consider myself to be a son of the church. I consider myself to be a faithful to the teachings of the church. So I'm very careful that people, when I say this, that I'm not spouting my beliefs, so to speak. I'm trying to convey as much as possible what I believe the church teaches, which I believe is most important. So that's my caveat onto all of this conversation. But when we look at creation, I think the first thing we have to look at when we look at the book of Genesis is what is the book? As Catholics, we believe that the first 5 books, are considered what the ancient Jews would consider the Torah. But a lot of that was oral tradition. Those were stories that were passed down from generation to generation within the ancient Hebrews to talk about how God brought the world into existence, how God brought the nation of Israel into existence, how God brought the Jewish people into existence, and how he related with the Hebrew people and later on the Jewish people. So is Genesis literal? Is Genesis a literal history book? And the answer is no, it's not. Because ancient Hebrew texts cannot be read in a literal version just like we read our history. The history, I heard it explained one time that ancient Hebrew history really, they write in more of an elliptical fashion. In other words, they'll teach concepts, they'll teach ideas, and sometimes they'll go in and they'll repeat things several times for emphasis. They will also use a lot of illustrations because that's how they pass things down. That's how they taught things to the next generation. In the Western culture, we have a much more linear version of history. So when we record history, we tend to record things that happened in a very sequential manner. This happened, step 1, then step 2, this happened, then step 3, and so forth. And that's not really how you can read Genesis. The other issue is that if you start to read Genesis in a literal fashion, as in things happened exactly like they said is in the first chapter of Genesis, then you're going to run into some issues. One of the first issues that you're going to run into is the fact that in the very first verse of Genesis, it says that the earth was formless and void. So we see that the earth was already there in the first chapter of Genesis. The first verse talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. So there was already something there at the time of the first chapter of Genesis. The other problem that you have is that when you read down the first chapter of Genesis, they talk very sequentially. The writer, Moses, talks about the first day this happened, the second day this happened, the third day this happened, so forth and so forth. But you come to find out that the sun, which defines a 24-hour day, was not created until like the 25th verse of the first chapter of Genesis, which I think was day 4. So you've already had 3 days, quote unquote, that have passed without the sun and moon. That causes a problem when you're looking at a literal standpoint and you're trying to read Genesis from a literal standpoint. Now, from the scientific perspective, or people that consider Genesis not to be reliable, those are the things that people can tend to point to and say, see, I told you Genesis is not true because of these flaws or these things in the first chapter of Genesis. Therefore, the rest of the Bible can't be trusted because Genesis has these issues. And that's not right either. Genesis is a specific genre of literature. All literature is, I think I talked about this in my previous posts, but all scriptural literature cannot be read in the same way or in the same manner. And Genesis can't be read as a literal book. I think the best way for us to look at Genesis and to read it is, number one, we look at those 6 days as ages of time. We don't know how long those days were. I tend to have a little bit of both methods. The first day, or quote, of the first age, when the water was separated from the land, we don't know how long that took. We don't know how long that took. We don't know how long it took for the stars to form. We don't know how long it took for all of these. But the way that the ancient Hebrew text defined it were 6 days, because that's how they defined it. But just because God took ages or millions of years to create the earth, does that make him any less God, or does that make our faith any less valid? And the answer is absolutely, obviously not. And I think that's where we come in with science. Science can take these things that we've seen and see how the earth has evolved over the past millions of years. So the church would say, hey, look, if you want to believe a literal 6-day creation period, have at it. Nothing wrong with that. Personal preference. There's not really a lot to back that up other than just the way that you read scripture. I would tend to side with science and say, look, I believe in a very old earth. I believe that the earth has been around for millions of years. Now, the next question that people would say is, what about evolution? If you believe in a old earth, then you must believe in evolution. Well, here is the truth about what the church would say about evolution. Evolution is actually endorsed by the church. Now, there's a difference. Keep listening, because if you stop there, you're going to miss the key to this. Evolution is simply a change. It is a change is a development of species. We can look through humanity, we can look through science, we can see that humans have changed over time. We can see that humans have evolved over time. We can see that animals, plants, the planet, everything has evolved over time. So do I believe in evolution? Yes. Now, the caveat to that is what the church does not teach and the church does not endorse. The church teaches very specifically that while we do believe that evolution is a viable scientific option, Darwinism is not. And Darwinism actually cannot be proved. Darwinism teaches, and forgive me, somebody's going to correct me out there online, but Darwinism basically teaches that all of living creatures began from a single-cell organism. Everything that we have basically was a single-cell organism that basically came out of the sludge of the earth, and there was a point that it flipped the missing link and everything started to change from that point. I don't agree with that. And what we must believe as Christians and as Catholics is that the backstory and the origin of humanity is that humans are created in the image of God. That God created man and breathed life into man. In fact, there was an article that I read. You can find it online. It was an article from a scientific journal over in England, and this scientific research has been going on for years and years, about how they're tracing humanity back. And there's actually some very good research that shows that humanity has been able to be traced back to a single man and a single woman over in the Middle Eastern area of the world. And I believe that. You may not believe that, but I do believe that humanity is in the image and likeness of God, that they were created by God and He breathed life into them. Now, was there a literal Garden of Eden? Was there a literal tree of good of life, tree of good and evil? Was there a literal flood? Things of that nature are things that a lot of people like to discuss as well. When we're looking at those sections in Genesis, I think they all have to be looked at more of an individual basis. Adam and Eve basically are the names that we've assigned to the first man and woman. Those are the names that the ancient Hebrews, assigned to the first man and woman. It doesn't necessarily mean that was their literal names. If you look back in Genesis, there are actually meanings to those names, and you can see where the Hebrews basically said there was this woman named Eve. But I think the bigger question when you start looking at creation, when you start looking at the flood, when you start looking at the children of Israel and the Exodus story, is what is God trying to teach us through these narratives? What is God trying to say? And I think that when we start looking at these narratives, what we see is that humanity is chosen by God. That God, from the very beginning, has chosen humanity. Why did He make humanity? Why did God, an all-powerful God, make humanity? I don't know. I can't answer that question. There is a section in Genesis, though, where it says God did not want to be alone. God wanted a creation. And there's all sorts of theological discussions that I'm not qualified to answer from that point, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm qualified to answer at this point, because I'm not. But what I do know is there's a story of humanity where God starts with a covenant, an agreement, a covenant between Adam and Eve. And if you look at that covenant through the stories and through history, God slowly expands that covenant. That covenant was with Adam and Eve. And then the covenant expands to Noah and his family. And then it expands to Abraham and his family. Then it expands to Jacob. Then it expands to David, to where we finally see the fulfillment of that in Christ. And there's a timeline of the covenants of God with humanity that expands with time. So I don't know if that helps a lot, but what I can tell you is this. Believing in an old earth and looking at science does not disprove Genesis and make Genesis inaccurate and Christianity inaccurate. I do believe that if we read and we start to define Genesis literally as a 6-day creation period, I do think it tends to run the risk of turning a lot of people off, because the scientific evidence just does not support a literal 6-day period. So I hope that helps. It gives you something to think about. There's a lot of research out there that you can do, but basically that's a good starting point of what we believe about Genesis. So don't let it discourage you when people talk about an old earth. It just shows how God created the earth, what He used, how He did it. It's like a map. It is like a map. So have a great afternoon.